That's it. You won't want to miss it. Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. The Adam-God doctrine has been one of the most controversial doctrines in all of the LDS Church. Has it always been that way? In our next conversation with David Patrick and Benjamin Shaffer of Christ Church, we'll talk about how this has changed over the years and which LDS leaders have both supported it and opposed it. Check out our conversation. Is there anything else that we can wrap up this with the Adam-God doctrine? I realize we haven't covered everything, but what are some other basic things that we should know about that?
Well, this isn't something you can't find more information on. There are more resources out there. Multiple books have been written on the subject. We've written information on the subject in a small pamphlet form to make it simple. So it's not like you're going to be twisting in the wind when you're trying to find information. And guess what? What was that great quote about this stone doesn't fit? And
right.
Have you got that one? We should read that because I think it's a good one.
So basically, the early pioneer saints, they really struggled with this doctrine, just like Mormons today do.
Let's preface that for a second.
Sure.
Because here's Brigham Young finally publicly talking about the Adam-God doctrine in conference to the brethren and in priesthood meeting. And then right after that, it goes all out to the entire church and then put in the temple ceremony as a lecture at the veil. I mean, it's all brought out, but you still have people going, wait a minute, I don't get it. And you've got a huge amount of people that are converts from Protestant faiths. Mm-hmm. And they're like, wait a minute, does not compute.
Right.
And they may not have been going to the temple every month on, your night either for a long time. So they may not have that much exposure to the temple ceremony either. And when you live in Nephi, it's not easy to go to Manti just this afternoon and come back home tonight. Right. So access to information like that would have been challenging and difficult. And so I think they recognize that. And so I think this is a great quote that you can read.
Yeah, so Franklin D. Richards wrote in the Millennial Star, it's volume 16, page 534 if you have the bound volumes. Of course, Millennial Star, he's talking to converts in England. They're coming out of the Church of England. They have this idea that God is not a human, God is not a man, as in the King Follett Discourse. And now they're being taught Adam God. So they didn't get any build-up, right? They're getting this without the explanations of Joseph Smith about how this works or what the titles are. They're just like, wait, Adam is God? What are you talking about? And so Franklin D. Richards is trying to make sure that we don't hemorrhage members in England where this is published, because he knows that people are concerned about it, and all the general authorities are teaching this at the time. And so he writes, Adam is our Father and our God, but I have to say, do not trouble yourselves, neither let the saints be troubled about that matter. He goes on to say, tell the saints that if this stone does not seem to fit into the great building of their faith just now, roll it aside. You can help them to roll it out of the way, so that they will not stumble against it while at their daily duties. And it will be but a short time until they will find a place in their building where no other stone will fit. Then it will be on hand all right and will come into its place in the building of their faith with the sound of hammer or chisel. And I think that is kind of the point. If somebody's struggling with this, we don't say, oh, no, you have to accept this. If you're not getting it, that's okay. But I believe that as your faith progresses, as Franklin D. Richards said, you'll find a place eventually where you kind of have to realize, am I really a child of God or not? And then it starts making more and more sense, and eventually it'll come into its place and you'll get it. But in the meantime, don't worry about it. Don't let it trouble you too much. One of the last things I do want to say about Adam God is that I believe that, and the purpose of my presentation yesterday was really about Joseph Smith being the origin of Adam God teachings. The more you don't like it, the more
because a lot of people attribute it to Brigham Young, is that right?
That is right.
Yeah.
So the more you don't like this doctrine, the more you want to compartmentalize it, make it as fringe and as small as possible, because you want to keep the rest of the stuff. You want to keep singing I'm a child of God in primary, but you just but you don't want
So all the
this
bad
other
things
stuff.
went with
So all the
Brigham.
bad things go with Brigham, and we say, Brigham, there was some bad stuff here. You take the bad stuff, we're keeping the rest. Whereas I view this as an expansive doctrine, which I think I can teach out of the New Testament very effectively, even without Joseph Smith. But Joseph Smith, as the origin of the Adam and God teachings, can really challenge people because they want to say this was just Brigham Young. And so the last thing I kind of want to say is that I believe that it's very clear from the historical and the doctrinal record that Joseph Smith was the origin of these Adam God teachings. And so the last thing I guess I'd like to bring up is first, Brigham Young and all the early presidents of the church that knew Joseph personally, they all said that it was Joseph that taught them the doctrine. None of them took credit for having revealed this. And there's some additional quotes that make this abundantly clear that Joseph Smith was teaching this, at least in Nauvoo. In 1844, just in April of 1844, so not very long before the martyrdom, there's, in the Council of 50 Minutes, it says, the chairman, Joseph Smith, explained the meaning of the word Amen, which signifies the first man or first God. So first man and first God are equivalent in this statement. He says, and Amen Christ signifies the first man's son. So he's not even just saying Amen Christ is the son of God. He's saying he is the son of the first man. So Joseph Smith is clearly teaching Adam God here. He also explains in the History of the Church, Volume 3, it's also in the Teachings of Prophet Joseph Smith, talking about the Ancient of Days. And there's a bunch of places where he mentions the Ancient of Days being Adam or Michael, D&C 107.
Throughout the Doctrine and Covenants, yeah.
Yeah, D&C 107, D&C 27, I find especially interesting because D&C 2711 talks about Michael or Adam, the father of all, the prince of all, the Ancient of Days. And a recent correlation was brought up that we know that Joseph Smith had a copy of and regularly referred to Clarke's commentary. And so when he
Adam Clarke's commentary.
That's right. So the full title of Adam Clarke's commentary is really long, but basically we know that he had it. We know he used it when he was doing the inspired version of the Bible extensively as he was contemplating what does it mean, how does God want me to phrase this in my inspired translation. But also that he referred to it multiple times before these sections came out stating the Ancient of Days is Adam. And Clarke's commentary, which he had to have read, especially before he talks about the meaning of Adam on Amen, which he talks about being Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7 in the commentary it says, the Ancient of Days is God Almighty. And this is the only place in the sacred writings where God the Father is represented in human form. So now we believe that God the Father is represented in human form in other scriptures as well as Mormons. But there's three really important things in there that Joseph Smith was reading multiple times apparently as he was talking about this. And that is that the Ancient of Days is God. So Joseph Smith has no other context for that title. If he says Adam is the Ancient of Days, it's exactly the same as if Joseph Smith had said Adam is God. In a teaching, in the Doctrine and Covenants, in any of that. He's very explicit. He knows that the Ancient of Days is God. And so does every other Latter-day Saint who's hearing this. Nobody comes up with any other explanation, until James E. Talmage at least, for what the Doctrine and Covenants means when it says Adam is the Ancient of Days.
And what did Talmage say?
Talmage said, well, since it's Adam, and we we believe that God is above all, in and through all, he kind of subscribed to that omni-God idea, that God is everywhere, omnipresent, omnipotent, and so forth. He said, because Adam was a man, was a mortal, and we believe God is different than that, Joseph Smith must have meant something else by Ancient of Days. So
Talmage is distancing himself from Adam God.
Right. Talmage is distancing himself from Adam God and trying to say that in LDS theology, Ancient of Days doesn't mean God anymore. It's a special title only for Adam.
Okay.
That doesn't mean God. But in all of Jewish, all of Christian, even all of Muslim theology, Ancient of Days means God.
Yeah, go to Jewish.org. They're a Jewish encyclopedia. Bam, it's right there.
Right. In fact, here's a fun one for your viewers, since this is on the internet. Open up a new window, type in Ancient of Days into the search bar, and you will see, pops up, very first thing is, Ancient of Days is a title of God. This is what Google says. I mean, not that Google has the religious authority, but basically this was never disputed. And certainly in Joseph Smith's time, no one had ever given any alternate explanation. And so, essentially, for the first century or so of Mormonism, every LDS person who read the Doctrine and Covenants was like, "Oh, he says Adam is God. Oh, that's weird." Or, "Oh, I get it." But they never thought that Joseph Smith was saying anything other than that directly in Scripture, in canonized LDS Scripture. But again, Clark's commentary goes beyond that. Not only is the Ancient of Days God Almighty, it says that God the Father is represented in human form. So we have another place where Joseph Smith is thinking about his theology. All right, God the Father, human form. What does that sound like? Well, the King Follett Discourse, after all of that, he says, this is the great mystery. If you could roll back the heavens and see God as he is, you would see that he is a man. Right? That God is one of us, and therefore that we are God's.
Now that was 1844.
The King Follett.
The minutes of the
right.
The Council of 50.
Right.
And then this is another one that Anson Call, he quotes in 1844. He says, "Now regarding Adam, he came here from another planet," and these are the things that he attributes to the sayings of Joseph the prophet. "Now regarding Adam, he came here from another planet, an immortalized being, and brought his wife Eve with him, and by eating of the fruit of this earth became subject to death and decay, and he became of the earth, earthly, was made mortal and subject to death." End quote. And so here you've got 1844. This is not Brigham. And these are attributed to the sayings of Joseph. And so it's just another indication in the record, albeit a long time ago, about Joseph Smith teaching this doctrine to people.
And I've got to bring out one more quote, too. Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith on page 157. This was the quote that D. Michael Quinn was saying after my presentation. Now, this is as direct as it gets anyway, and this is Joseph Smith teaching the Adam God. He says, "The priesthood is an everlasting principle, and existed with God from eternity, and will to eternity, without beginning of days or end of years. The keys have to be brought from heaven whenever the gospel is sent, and when they are revealed from heaven, it is by Adam's authority."
Or you could say God's authority.
Right. Directly making Adam equivalent with God, revealing the priesthood from all everlasting.
So you're saying that Quinn would agree with you that Joseph Smith taught Adam God? Is that what you're saying?
I believe he said so. If you want to look up the Sunstone audio, he basically said so on the recording there. So.
All right.
Well, at least he said that would substantiate what you said.
Yeah, we'll have to provide a link to Sunstone and that. So, but is it safe to say, it sounds like Orson Pratt had a problem with this, James Talmage had a problem with this, President Kimball had a problem with this, Bruce R. McConkie had a problem with this. Is it safe to say that this doctrine is disputed?
Oh, sure. I believe it was a matter of controversy even in the Nauvoo Expositor. So yeah, it's controversial.
Okay, so this has always been a very controversial topic.
We feel like it went from
within
a doctrine...
the LDS Church as well as without.
Sure.
The progression, or digression, as you might call it, went from a doctrine to a theory into obscurity. And now we're saying, let's bring it out of obscurity. Let's make sure people understand how it works. And if you want to know how it works, I guess.
Well, and I know that Lindsay Hansen Park one time said the reason why the church discourages Adam God is because it leads directly to polygamy. Would you agree with that?
I would. Basically, I view the Adam God doctrine, like I was saying earlier, as the keystone or foundation of all Mormon doctrine. I believe that this basically applies to any religion. If you understand the ontology, or the ontology is kind of the question of what is the nature of a type of thing. If you understand the ontology of God, what is a God, and you understand the ontology of man and how they relate to each other, you basically have the basis for all the faith and practice of any religion. There's a reason why Buddhists and Hindus don't want to eat meat. It's because the ontology of humans and the ontology of animals is basically the same. This idea that spiritual energy, at least, if not spiritual individualism, can travel both between humans and animals. We're the same kind. So that's why they don't do that. But the Adam God doctrine for Mormons is essentially that major question. What is God? What is man? How do they relate to each other? And as Joseph Smith said in the King Follett, our ontology is that God is a man and men are gods. We are of the same ontological type. We're the same species as God. We're not a separate species. We're not just pets. We're children. And if that's the case, then that begins to explain everything else. So, for example, you asked, how does this relate to plural marriage? Well, if God is peopling worlds, not only that, with Eve possibly being a plural word in Hebrew as well, if God is peopling worlds, and his family is constantly growing because he is this creator God who expands throughout the universe, then if we're going to be like him, we need to also create and people worlds. Now, I know people say, well, why couldn't you do that monogamously? But I think that, again, all of Mormon marriage ideas are still intertwined with polygamy, pretty much inextricably. And so, if you're going to be creating and peopling worlds together and expanding your family, this is the other reason why Adam God is controversial, is because he says God the Father and Mary had a son, Jesus Christ. This basically makes Mary at least a second wife to God the Father, with Eve being the first. Then there's also the Midrash, which we usually embrace, which talks about characters such as Lilith and Sarah being other wives of Adam. But essentially, if you're going to have an infinite increase in family relationships, then that's basically where the polygamy comes in. And it's based on this idea that God, therefore, is a polygamist. And so if we're going to become like God, that's part of the package.
Wow. All right. You actually answered my last question there without even me asking it, so that was good. So you can be a monogamous you can believe in Adam God and be a monogamist.
For sure.
Okay.
At the risk of being slightly personal, we're both monogamists. And we still have positions in our church and all of that. But we don't deny that polygamy is part of this great, big, beautiful, diverse mess we call Mormonism. And we kind of, to a certain extent, have to take ownership of that and understand it, we believe. And so it is part of our doctrine.
Yeah, and we recognize, however, that people, when they start to research things and they say, well, wait a minute, why isn't my church teaching me this? Apparently it was once taught, and now they're not teaching it. And that leads to other doctrines that have been put aside. But we say we're taking those off the shelf, and here they are for you. And we realize that can be a conflict. And why they would then say, well, this gateway doctrine of the Adam God doctrine, we better shut that down.
I'm going to call that Adam God is now the marijuana of fundamentalism.
Cannabis. We prefer the term cannabis. So yeah, that is kind of an interesting thing. The LDS Church has oftentimes been talking about putting things on the shelf. And I suppose that's basically what Franklin D. Richards was saying in that quote, too. Let's put it aside for now, put it on the shelf. Maybe you can deal with it later. But I think progress is really made in faith by having that faith crisis. And you got to unpack that shelf. You got to unload it. And if that's a crisis, that's an opportunity for growth. So.
Well, I think you eloquently explained why the LDS Church doesn't want to talk about the Adam God doctrine.
I suppose that's true. So, confirmation bias. Anybody listening to this now has plenty of reasons not to like the Adam God doctrine if they don't want to unpack those things. So.
All right. Well, Benjamin Shaffer and David Patrick, thank you so much for participating here on Gospel Tangents. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
I hope you enjoyed listening to David Patrick and Benjamin Shaffer of Christ Church. It was fun to sit down with an apostle and a 70, even if it's not from my church. It's always fun. And David and Benjamin, it was really fun talking to you guys. Love to have you back on the show. So thanks again. I really appreciate your time that you spent here. In our next conversation, I'm excited to have a fellow podcaster on the show, Lindsay Hansen Park. She is famous for her Year of Polygamy podcast, and we're going to talk about polygamy and its relationship to modern Mormonism.
Well, it's my theory that Mormonism, Brighamite Mormonism, so anyone that came across with Brigham Young and all the breakoff groups that sort of come from that are completely shaped by polygamy. The Doctrine, Theology. I often say the LDS Church is still a polygamous church, if not in our hearts. Brigham Young asked everyone to be a polygamist, if only in their hearts. And I think that people took that really seriously. And so for me, I can see traces of polygamy just about anywhere.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please support Gospel Tangents and become a subscriber. For just $5 a month, go to patreon.com/gospeltangents and you can hear the entire interview. And you can also get transcripts available at either our Amazon website, or if you want to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website at gospeltangents.com and you can click the yellow subscribe button. Of course, we're also on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other places. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. And don't forget to click here to subscribe on YouTube, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again for listening.